Well, I sort of came into ceramics totally from left field because I got married very young, and Steve went to grad school in Iowa. So we were in Iowa in 1965, 66, and there I was, and I was wrenched out of school and newly married, and I didn't have anything to do. And so I answered an ad in a throwaway newspaper that said 5 ceramic lessons for, or no, wait, let me get it right. 3 ceramic lessons for $5. So I went, I paid my money, and I went to Mrs. Massey's basement, and I started doing ceramics in her basement, which was basically a kind of very early style, folky, homespun, paint your own studio, where you went in her basement and she sold you greenware and underglaze colors, and you started working, painting on greenware, and then she glazed it and fired it for you. And I was just so enamored of the whole process of painting on the clay and having it fired. And I'd never really ever done any ceramics in high school. It wasn't available where I went to school. And so then we came back to California and ended up in Berkeley because Steve wanted to go to grad school at Berkeley. And there was this whole ceramic program. So I enrolled and transferred all my undergrad units from UC Riverside and started studying with Peter Vokus, who I wasn't familiar with at the time, but I just was very fortunate and landed in an incredibly exciting environment at the best possible time that could have happened. So in 1967, I finished my undergrad and then launched into my grad studies all here at Berkeley. And I've just stuck here ever since.
And how would you characterize Peter Vokus's teaching?
Well, this is the question I get all the time. And it's a really complicated question to answer, because he didn't teach in the traditional way that we think when we say teach. We think, oh, you get lessons, you get an example or a prompt, and then you launch the students into answering that, and you coach them how to answer it. He didn't teach in that way. He taught by working, and he worked. And we were welcome at his studio, which we did. You had to go late at night. Things always were late at night. And he came in the studio at school and he worked. And that was pretty much how he taught. And then he walked around and he looked at what you were doing. He never forgot anything he saw. He had a phenomenal memory. And so he really taught us, me, and the people who stayed and were very excited to study with him. He taught us what it was like to be an artist, and what it took, what it really took, what it took to have a studio. At the time that I was studying with him, he was doing a lot of bronze casting. And so his studio at that time was a foundry. His studio was right here near where I eventually built my studio, right here on the railroad tracks in West Berkeley. And then he later moved to the Dome. But he was right here, and the studio was a foundry. And so for me as a student, what I learned was, oh, well, if you want to cast bronze, then you turn your studio into a foundry. You know, if you want to do ceramics, you create a ceramic studio. And I think that was really just incredibly significant, because I think of all the music students, and what they learn is how to get up and how to play and how to behave in public as a musician, how to perform and what it takes. And I think what we saw was, what do you do to be an artist and what it takes to be an artist? And that's really what I think the power of his teaching. And of course, his work itself, you saw his work, and there was a huge exhibition, the Abstract Expressionist Ceramic Exhibition at the SF MoMA took place during the time I was a student. And then later that same year, this is all in 1968, the Funk Show took place at Berkeley in the campus steam room, which was at that time used as a gallery for the campus. Peter Sells was the new director of the University Art Museum. But it was everything was very funky, not just the work, the place, the studio. Oh, I get asked all the time what it was like to study with Peter Voulkos, what his teaching techniques were like. I get that question a lot. So I got my master's in 1970. So I was at Berkeley for 3 years, and I got my master. You know, I finished my undergrad, did my grad, and then I got my master's degree in 1970. And my first teaching job, also which started in 1970, was at SUNY Albany in New York. And there was a woman named Fran Simchus, who unfortunately isn't with us anymore. And Fran Simchus hired me. She ran the program at SUNY Albany, and she hired me to teach. And she was really, really excited to have someone who'd studied with Voulkos, because she knew about him and she'd seen his work, and she was really interested in introducing that attitude into her program, or at least that background into her program. And she hired me to start teaching. And I think what I did at the time, the work I was doing was very influenced by the color and the airbrushing techniques that Ron Nagel, I forgot to mention, but Ron Nagel was teaching at the same time and was also one of my mentors at school. And he used a lot of color and the airbrush. And so I was very influenced by that, because I grew up in Southern California, and color has always been part of my thinking about artwork, and using color has always been part of my process in whatever I do. And so I did a lot of small cups using China paints and underglaze, and everything I've always done has been sculptural and non-functional, but always with the reference to functional work. So they're based on cup forms or pot forms, but I've never been interested in function because it's just too limiting. You have to, for things to function, they have to have rules, and I've always been breaking the rules. Well, as a student, I definitely was not exposed to it, because Berkeley at that time was all abstract and very vessel based. You know, Ron Nagel was doing making cups, and Voulkos's forms have always been thrown and then altered, but they still have that interior space and the vessel sort of language to the work. And so I've always kept that vessel language with me as I've moved forward at different scale. I think it's only as I came back later on as a professor and started teaching that I introduced my students to the figurative work, because I think it's important that they see that. But it was never part of my vocabulary. And I was always, you know, I'd seen the work of Manuel Neri, and of course you see Arneson's work at that time. But it wasn't part of my thinking when I went in the studio to work on my pieces. I think location is always it's certainly a subconscious current in anyone's work, because you know you're very affected by where you live, and just on a personal level, and it flows into your work even if you're not conscious about it. But I've always been really attracted to the interface between the built environment and the natural environment. And I'm not particularly an outdoors person. I mean, I like the outdoors. I like the windows open and the doors open and the sun shining in. And I have a beautiful garden and I love that, but I'm not a wilderness person. That's not I prefer the beach. And so I think of that interface, and I think architecture plays more of a role in my thinking about how the work is placed, how it's exhibited, putting it on bases, putting it in architectural spaces. I think more from that interface between the human and the built. When I saw the Funk show, it was fun, and all the people in it, you know, the work was wild and fun, and a lot of it didn't seem to even have any relationship to the term. It was just a wild and crazy exhibition of very experimental work at the time, work that was being created using vacuum forming processes, a lot of technology, early, you know, technology being introduced into studio art. and vacuum forming and, multi-materials, crazy materials, fur and wire. So I thought, it was really fun to see, but when you saw the piece Vocus had in the show, it was really a stretch to even think of that as relating to the title of the show. So I don't think I've ever taken that term and that as a description of work. I've never really taken it very seriously. I guess you could say I don't believe in it. I think certain people's work, you might call it funky, but I don't think there's any kind of movement or body of work that embodies that term. Well, I hope I do. I mean, because you want people to be drawn to the work and have, an affection for it. So I think, my approach is very textural, and I want people to be drawn to the material and get a feeling for the materialness of what I'm working with and how it was once very, very soft and now it's frozen in place. And that's kind of a magical ability of ceramic to be like that. You have this malleable, soft plastic material that you can build with at any scale. And then it becomes, frozen and hard and permanent. It never, ever goes away, lasts for millennia. And I think that is a very emotional connection for me. I love that part of the process, the hardening of this material once you've created it, and the ability to blend the colors and the surface, like I put text and imagery on the surface and then have that become a permanent part of the piece. It's not just an additive thing stuck on. It's again melded into the clay body itself. Well, I do a lot of drawing, and I always have, but the works themselves don't have a specific plan. They're very serendipitous and have a certain amount of spontaneity to them. I usually start out when I'm working, I usually work in a series. So I'll sort of set out for what a general sense of what I'm trying to do. And like with the pieces you see behind me and the big pots that are in the show, one of my goals there was to work at this larger scale. And so in that sense, I have a format and actually technical ways of working so I can get to that goal, because you can't just start. You have to have I had these big pookies that are big bowls to start the base in and then build up from there. And so I have some plan, and I maybe make a few line drawings to sort of say it's going to be like this or this, but no, they're not very well worked out beforehand. But I do a lot of drawing, and you can see some on the wall here in the studio, and of course there are a couple of drawings in the exhibition, and there are my notebooks in the exhibition. But I do those because I just love doing it, and there's a relationship between them, a visual and an emotional relationship, and a color relationship between all the works on paper and the works in clay. But they're not literally partnered together. They just look good together. Yeah, the sketchbooks are just always been part of my being as an artist, is sketching things out, thinking about things. And I think in the sense of planning work, I often jot down ideas. And so sometimes it might be a little sketch, or it might just be a few words. So the sketchbooks are kind of an ongoing way of thinking and then putting things down. And a lot of mine are just collages. I have done some very purposeful ones. For a long time, very recently, I had a studio in Baltimore, and I would do these very purposeful sketchbooks every summer when I was there in the studio. That would be where I would fill whole notebooks with a series of watercolors, all on, say, a theme of tea bowls or on a theme of bottles, so that, my goal was to have, say 3 sketchbooks all finished that summer. But a lot of them are just haphazard collections of ideas and drawings, and I paste things in, found objects, and you know, things cut out from other sources, maybe my daughter's handprint when she was a little tiny kid, and, you know, just things that I find appealing and visually interesting, because there are things that I think sketchbooks are things you go back to and look through, and they inform your mind and your ideas. And you go back and look and say, oh, that was a really wonderful combination, and it just kind of jogs your memory or jogs your intellect to, you know. And so, and especially because I collect text also in the sketchbook, so I'll say, oh, I'd forgotten about that poem, that'll be really good to use, you know, in this new work that I'm doing, something like that. I don't know if it was 12 or 13 years that I had my studio in Baltimore. My daughter and my grandchildren are in Baltimore, and so we'd spend the summers there. And nobody spends their summers in Baltimore, but it was air conditioning, and I had a studio there. And so yes, I really increased the output of creating work on paper, because that studio was dedicated to working on paper. So I did a lot of these big collages and drawings and a lot of big watercolor paintings then. It was very exciting. So they were really a whole body of work in themselves. So the series, the trophy vessels, which are featured in the exhibition, came about. I was working on these large pots, which you can see behind me, and which I think there are a couple that are not designated as trophy vessels in the exhibition, and then these large pots on the video. Um, I was working at that scale, and I started thinking about the abstract expressionist women and looking at their work just as inspiration, and because they were um, really significant. And I had met Grace Hardigan. She showed in Baltimore. She lived and had her home and studio in Baltimore, and she showed there. And I had an opportunity to see a lot of her work. Actually, family members have work in her collection and their collections, her work and their collections. And I got to meet her at an opening at one of her shows. And so I was thinking about those women in that era that had just preceded me, you know, as a generation before me. And then the show opened, the Abstract Expressionist Women uh, exhibition opened in Colorado, and then it traveled to Palm Springs. So I went down to Palm Springs and saw the show. And it was just mind blowing, the power of this work, and how just really beautiful and stunning in the scale and the way they handled their materials. And of course, you know, they've kind of been hidden for all these years, except for Helen Frankenthaler and maybe um, Lee Krasner. Most of them or Elaine de Kooning, most of them had remained very obscure, and their work was just magnificent. And so I just thought, well, I wanted to pay tribute to them. And so I started, you know, carried on creating these large vessels and made them specifically for certain of the women painters, just, you know, because I admired some of them very specific works. The pots aren't, the trophy pots aren't specific to, I mean, they're specific to each woman because I put their name on them. But they're not about their work in any direct way. Occasionally I drew from their palette some of the colors that I selected for the work. I would draw like the Helen, there's a really stunning Helen Frankenthaler that's at the Crocker Museum, and I drew from the palette of one of her paintings to create the coloration for that trophy. And I think with the Lee Krasner, which is in the exhibition, I also drew from her palette tended to be very black and white, and so I kind of focused on that. But the pots don't really bear any relationship to the women themselves or their work. The pots are really mine, and I think of them like the Heisman Trophy, or, you know, the MVP player gets a trophy at the end of the year, the season. They're really trophies to say, you know, you were magnificent, you did this incredible job, and I just want to honor you by doing this. Um, well, everybody does that. I mean, everybody projects that human form onto vessels, And when I'm working, I don't really think of it that way, and it's not my intention, but vessels have that connotation, and that's just historic. It doesn't have anything to do with me. It's there. And they do have feet and necks and shoulders and arms, and so I think that's just kind of a natural component of it being a vessel. And of course, it has an interior space like the human body, and the exterior skin. So yeah, that's just there. It's just a natural. It has nothing to do with my way of working or my vision as I create the forms, but it's certainly always part of the vocabulary of talking about and looking at vessels. This recent work, the shapes definitely reference. Sorry, they definitely reference classical amphora and Greek and Attic vases. I did that very purposely, just because it's a beautiful profile. I've spent a lot of time looking at that work and thinking about it, and I love the wild flaring arms that just come out in huge curves. And in that grouping of white vessels that's in the exhibition, I really emphasized that phenomena of those flaring arms, those loose, big, loopy handles. And so yeah, that reference, I was very conscious of that and thinking of that. And I think, yes, they're in the exhibition. There's a black and cream colored piece with lines on it, and it has these straight arms like this piece, right, that piece right there, this piece. And those come directly from Attic vases. There's a series of them that they have at the Walters Museum in Baltimore that has these straight arms that I just love, where the arm parallels the neck. So I think of that a lot, drawing from those sources, yes. So the all-white vessels are entitled "Intentionally Left Blank" because there's nothing left to say. And they were made specifically in response to the prior administration that was elected before this current administration, before the Biden administration. And the horror of the whole thing and the language that was spewed out was so horrific that I just felt there were no words that were adequate to explain the horrors that were taking place, that language had become inadequate. And so I did this series that were intentionally left blank. And I didn't put the poetry and the kind of interesting text that I usually put on my work on those pieces. And so they were done in a sort of direct response to something that was happening to all of us at that time. And the handles, it was kind of interesting development. They are directly a reference to kintsugi, which is a Japanese technique for repairing broken pottery, basically, where you use gold to enhance what's been broken. So in this case, they weren't broken, but I joined them using gold because I created the handle separately for technical reasons, so that I could have those great looping handles and have them be graceful. And then I wanted the idea of mending. So the concept of mending something using gold was my thinking behind why they're like the way they are. The other goal was using porcelain. So unlike the clay on the other pieces, which is all red, very rugged red clay, those white pieces are all cone 10 porcelain, which is a very different material and process than I do in the other bodies of work. And I just really wanted to take porcelain and have it be rough and handled, manipulated in this kind of strong way, not to kind of say, porcelain, it has a reputation for being very refined and very thin and delicate, but it doesn't have to be. It's a very strong and tough material. And I wanted to demonstrate that physically with the work So you see that in the way it's gouged and twisted, and there's lots of cracks, and things are kind of on the verge of collapse. And that's kind of part of the language of this body of work, is that they're always right there on the verge of collapse. And then of course you fire them and they become permanent, and it's fixed in time and in place. So the materiality and that sense of time is all part of the work as well.
So we're to understand these as social commentary in a way. So do you want to say that about the temporality and the way in which they on the verge of collapse is your way of conveying a socio-political message?
Yeah, I mean, my work is never, it's like the trophies for the abstract expressionist women. The work is never overtly political or political social commentary, but it's always there. We live in a political world. I mean, everything we do is political. Our names are political. Where we shop is political. Everything we do is political. We can't escape it. And so that's there in the work, and the white wares, and of course the trophies are more direct, more obvious reference to it. Well, the text on my work is very important. I've used it for, I don't know, 30, 40 years. I've included text and imagery, less imagery, but text and some imagery on my work, always. It's almost always screened on, and I like the screening process because it's very malleable and you can manipulate it. You can rub it out, you can rub it in, you can smear it. I'm a very haptic artist. I work with a lot of happenstance and a lot of accident, and things stay. I'm not very meticulous in a sense. I like a lot of spontaneity and keeping things. I look at something, and if there's kind of a smear or an accident and I like the way it looks, then I keep it. And you can see that I like the way things are made to be visible to the audience when they look at the work. When you look at a pot, I like you to be able to see how it was made. And so when you see the text, it's like that. I don't always need it to be legible. I have a library of text, and it's very meaningful to me. I collect it. It's not random. And a lot of it has to do with how pots are made. And they'll talk about what Chino glazes are, or glaze recipes out of my notebooks from when I was a student at Berkeley. And so one of the recipes called Pete's Black, which was Albany slip glaze that Pete used on his work, I used that recipe occasionally on the work. And so just letting the past walk through the present, that's always been a characteristic of my work, you can see it with the forms, using attic bases, and with the text, where I bring things from my past, from historic past, like talking about ancient glazes or old glaze recipes, and letting that information walk through the present, because the past is always with us. Oh, my work is all hand-built, and I allow the seams to show. I allow the way the handles are put on to be exposed. I leave cracks. If cracks happen, I often leave them. It's important to understand that one doesn't have to do that. One can be very meticulous and make sure all that is obscured. But I really feel that how I make the work should be available for the viewer to see and to expose the way the work comes together. So you'll see the way there's the base of the pot, and then the way the neck comes on, and that section where they're joined is quite visible. And where the coils, when I use coils, you'll see each coil is completely visible. I like that, exposing the process, so it isn't like, oh, how is this made? It's like, oh, this is how it was made. It all comes together as a whole, but all the cracks and it's kind of like we are as people, that all of what we are is exposed. And so I like that in the work. And I think also when when you go in the museum and look at all those ancient Greek forms, I guess when they photograph, they look rather perfect. But when you see them, they're all kind of, a little tipsy, and the arms don't match. And certainly the drawings aren't symmetrical. Things are balanced and things are beautiful, but they're not symmetric and they're not perfectly formed like a machine made them. They're clearly hand built. And that's very evident. And so I've always cared about that quality of the clay, leaving the clay exposed, because as an artist, I choose a clay body for reasons. And I choose this red clay for certain reasons. And like I explained with the intentionally left blank, they're made out of porcelain for a reason. So I want that material to speak and to have a voice, because working with clay, I suppose it's true for anybody working with paint or working with printmaking, whatever you do, the material has a lot to say, and I like the material to speak as well as me. Well, I want to clarify, because we're using the word paint, but we really mean we're using ceramic color and they're all fired on. So I just like to clarify that, because they're painted with a brush, but it's ceramic material that's fired. So it's kind of hard sometimes for the lay person to understand it's not painted in the, it's not going to, it can't go away. But anyway, yes, the bases, especially those square blocks that are glazed in this really rough colors, are intentional to give more space. I guess that's where we go back to where we were talking about architecture and form, is to give more space to the pots that belongs to the pot, that it's not like a museum base where it could be arbitrary, but this is a specific architectural pediment that the piece sits on, that is meant for that particular work. Well, I guess in that, going back to we're talking about them as bodies, it's nice that they are there and confront you, you know, that they're at that human scale. And so they're not quite as, they're more like a teenager. They're not as large as an adult human, but they're pretty large. And so you see them, you know, as in conjunction with your own self. I made some notes about the abstract expressionist women, and I think one of the things that I've always hoped was part of my work, and what I certainly saw in their work, both physically, the timelessness of their work and how it transcended the era of when it was made. And that's something I hope that I'm able to do with my work. And of course, you don't know until hundreds of years have passed if that would be the case. But also the strength and the staying power that they had as artists, and what it took to be overlooked and to yet continue to work and do just magnificent paintings. And so I think seeing that really gives you inner strength to work as a woman artist, which continues to be an issue. I mean, it is not going away. And so, you know, I hoped when the women's movement came along that would ease the pain a little bit, but it hasn't changed. It's changed a lot, but it hasn't changed totally. And so seeing what they did and how they persevered and how they worked was just, it was just so inspiring. And to know that, you know, I was growing up when they were painting, you know, that we overlapped as generations. And of course, you know, so many of them did not have children or gave their children away. The issues that they faced, life is a little bit easier for us. I think Viola, and because she was near, you know, right here in my community, I think if I had been further away and not been close, I don't know if it would have had the impact. But being able to know her and now teach, you know, where she taught and the program that she founded, I think Viola had a profound impact on, and the scale that she worked in. I mean, my goodness, to work so large, and she isn't hardly any taller than I am. She's a very tiny woman. yes, her ability to function, because the Bay Area was dominated in the press and in the sort of uh, public perception was dominated by the men who were here teaching. And so here was Viola, one of the few tenured women in the country, working away alongside them, but she didn't get the kind of attention in her lifetime, or even now, that was equal to theirs. But she's an incredible role model, and we're working on an exhibition for NCECO that is coming up on Viola's role and the impact it had on the subsequent women teaching and students at CCA. She played a really important part of changing the field at that school. Viola Fry, who basically founded the program at California College of the Arts, where I teach, was here working alongside all the men during the era of the funk show and the abstract expressionist show. And she really empowered women at CCA and had women as, women students as studio assistants, firing the kilns and doing the work that only men got to do at all the other schools. So she was a huge influence. And if you look at the roster of faculty and students who have come, I don't know how to get this to stop, who have come out of CCA, it's very impressive. And we're working on my department chair, Nathan Lynch, and myself are working on an exhibition that's going to for NCECO, which is coming up in 2022. Which will highlight Viola Fry's role as a mentor and an artist, and how the role that she, how she empowered women at CCA going forward, and how it's continued in all this time. I hesitate to say what I'm going to move on to in clay, because it's not well formulated. I've been thinking a lot about what it might be, but it isn't very well crafted in my mind yet. But what I have been doing, and through what I've done throughout the whole pandemic, is a whole body of work on paper. And so it's text and image all on paper of FBI files and government documents on a man who emigrated to this country in 1929, and who was a political activist and a journalist, and was deported. And he was deported for his political views. And so this is in the 1930s. He was my mother's first husband, and my mother married him and he was deported and ended up going to Mexico. And so I've been doing a huge body of work around this. I went to Washington before the pandemic. I've been researching this body of work, the archives, and getting things through the Freedom of Information Act. I've been researching it for about 10 years. And so I had lots of material, and I'd been to the National Archives in Washington and the National Archives in Maryland, and had, made copies of his files. There's enormous amount of files. One file all by itself is 1,200 letters that were written in protest of his deportation. So I had been building up all this material, so I started creating a timeline and bringing the material forward, and doing a whole series of archival prints, very, very large, 40 by 55 inch prints of his files and imagery and photographs. So I've been doing that, and because this issue of immigration and deportation and the political use of deportation transcends all parties. I mean, he was deported under FDR. So it's a huge political tool, and I wanted to draw attention to that. Well, my work always addresses functional form. I mean, it has an interior space, and it has a reference, either if it's a cup or a teapot or these large vessel forms. It always addresses the history of use. And that's important to me, that they're domestic pieces and they belong in a domestic environment. They're not heroic. And I like to talk about the past in that way. The same way I bring the past in through text and image, I bring the past in through those references. But those, because the references are purely conceptual and metaphorical, they allow me to just explore and to be free, and I'm not bounded by any need that something has to pour or it has to have any certain constraints on it. But I've always been attracted to that metaphor of function and use as a background. Well, thank you for having me record this discussion. It's really enlightening. And my studio is here in West Berkeley, in a very historic area where there's lots of ceramic artists and lots of painters and other artists all around me. And Vocus's original studio, which was on the railroad tracks, is 2 blocks away. So I'm right here next to the train. And I find it, I really enjoy the sound. When I grew up in LA, we lived near a railroad track, and it's always has been part of my the soundtrack in my life. So thank you.